The cold wind cut through Daniel's face as he pulled his coat tighter around his body, staring out at the vast, snow-covered mountains of Alaska. At just 25 years old, he was an eager traveler, chasing dreams and opportunities wherever he could find them. But Alaska? This place was unlike any he had ever been to. Raw, mysterious, and untamed. And there was something more here than just adventure. Gold. That was the real reason why he and a small group of like-minded enthusiasts had ventured into this frozen wilderness. The promise of finding gold had lured them to this remote, dangerous land. The small wooden cabin where they were staying was barely warm, offering little protection from the harsh, endless cold outside. His companions, 3 other men, were worn out. The relentless freezing winds had taken their toll. Some had caught colds, coughing and complaining of body aches. "Daniel, you should stay inside today," advised Frank, the oldest of the group, as he rubbed his hands by the fire. "It's not worth the risk going out there alone." But Daniel couldn't sit still. "I just need some air. Maybe check out the river to the north." "I won't go far," he replied, pulling on his gloves and grabbing a small backpack with the essentials. The others didn't argue. They were too tired to fight him on it. Jack, the youngest of the group, shot him a warning look, but he knew Daniel was too stubborn to listen once he'd made up his mind. With cautious, deliberate steps, Daniel left the cabin, feeling the snow crunch beneath his boots. The solitude of the place was as peaceful as it was terrifying. The complete silence around him was only interrupted by the distant whistle of the wind or the occasional crack of frozen branches. As he followed a snow-covered trail, something unusual caught his eye. In the distance, along the frozen river, he saw what looked like a large dog walking slowly along the bank. Daniel stopped in his tracks. What could a dog be doing out here, in the middle of nowhere? His instincts kicked in immediately. Maybe there were campers nearby, or maybe there weren't. Curiosity getting the better of him, Daniel decided to approach, carefully making his way down the small hill that led to the river. The animal seemed tense, its posture rigid, its movements cautious. As Daniel got closer, his heartbeat quickened. This wasn't a dog. He was close enough now to see the thick grey fur and the cold, sharp eyes reflecting the faint light of the day. It was a wolf, a huge, wild wolf. Daniel froze in place. The wolf turned its head toward him, baring its teeth in a low, threatening growl. A chill shot down Daniel's spine, and his body locked up with fear. He knew there was no way he could outrun it. His legs felt rooted to the ground, and all he could do was breathe deeply and close his eyes, bracing for the attack. But nothing happened. Slowly, Daniel opened his eyes and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The wolf wasn't advancing. In fact, it couldn't move. His eyes focused on the animal's front legs, where a cruel trap clamped down, biting into its flesh. Reality crashed down on Daniel like a wave. The wolf wasn't free. It was trapped, bleeding, and desperate. And now, Daniel had a choice to make. His breath was shallow, and his mind raced with possibilities. He could walk away, leave the animal to its fate. But there was something in the way the wolf looked at him, something beyond just fear and aggression. Desperation, maybe, and something else. Something that almost felt like a plea for help. Okay, just stay calm, Daniel muttered, unsure if he was talking to the wolf or himself. But deep down, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Daniel stood still, his heart still racing in his chest. Every second seemed to stretch out, the wolf's tense gaze locked onto him, a low growl rumbling in its throat. The wolf's leg was caught in a cruel, rusted trap, and Daniel could see the blood staining the snow around it. The sharp metal teeth had bitten deep, and the animal was in visible pain. Damn it. What do I do now? Daniel thought, his eyes fixed on the injured creature. Every instinct in him screamed to back away. A trapped wolf was unpredictable, and a mother wolf, as he now realized, would be even more dangerous. But the reality was clear. If he didn't do something, the wolf would die there, trapped, alone, and helpless. He took a deep breath, trying to push away the fear. "Are you out here alone?" he asked softly, knowing full well the wolf wouldn't answer. But as he looked closer, something else caught his attention, and his stomach tightened. There, in the snow, were small tracks. Tiny paw prints, spaced unevenly, led away from the wolf, deeper into the forest. "Pups," Daniel whispered, a sense of urgency crashing over him. The wolf wasn't just trapped. She was a mother. Her pups were out there, vulnerable, possibly freezing or starving without her. If he didn't act, the mother would die, and her pups wouldn't survive either. His mind raced in two directions. On one hand, there was cold logic. Approaching a wild, injured wolf could be a death sentence. She was cornered, and cornered animals were known to attack. On the other hand, there was empathy. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving her like this, knowing that both she and her pups might not make it. He had to do something. Looking back at the wolf, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. Her breathing was labored, each breath puffing out in clouds in the freezing air. She was scared and in pain, but there was also something else in her expression. Desperation. "I can't just leave you here," he muttered, taking a step back. "I have to help." But how? Every time he edged closer, the wolf growled more intensely, her body recoiling as much as the trap would allow. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, feeling the pressure building. He had to act fast. Every minute meant more pain for her and less hope for her pups. Then he remembered something in his backpack. Jerky. Maybe, just maybe, food would calm her. Daniel opened his backpack slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements, and pulled out a strip of jerky. He tossed it toward the wolf, keeping a safe distance. The wolf sniffed the air, eyeing the food suspiciously, but didn't move. She was too wary, too distrusting to take the bait. "Okay, that's not going to work," Daniel muttered to himself, crouching down carefully. He needed a new plan. His eyes trailed the paw prints again, disappearing into the dense forest. A risky idea began to form in his mind. If he could find the pups and bring them back to her, maybe she'd trust him enough to let him help. But that would mean venturing deeper into the wilderness, further away from the safety of the camp, with time running out. The weight of the decision pressed down on his shoulders. Risk his life to save the wolf and her pups, or leave them to their fate. Daniel looked back into the wolf's eyes one more time. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. With the snow crunching underfoot and the wind biting at his face, Daniel took a deep breath and started following the tracks into the dark forest, unsure of what he would find. "I hope I don't regret this," he whispered, stepping away from the trapped wolf, her growls fading into the distance as he ventured further and further into the unknown, following the trail of small paw prints disappearing into the snowy wilderness. The search for the pups had begun. Each step Daniel took seemed to sink deeper into the snow, making the trek harder as he moved through the forest. The icy wind bit into his face, and the trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that made the trail of small paw prints harder to follow. His breath came out in ragged puffs, but he kept going. He had no choice. The wolf's pups were out there somewhere, and they were just as vulnerable as their mother. The tracks were erratic, as if the pups had scattered in fear, making the trail confusing. "Where are they?" Daniel muttered under his breath, his heart pounding with the urgency of the situation. The farther he got from the river and the trapped wolf, the more he realized how dangerous this was. He was alone, in the middle of an Alaskan wilderness, and the deeper he went into the forest, the more it felt like the trees were closing in on him. The silence around him was unsettling. Every crack of a branch or gust of wind sent a shiver down his spine. He kept his focus on the small prints, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Still, he had to keep moving. After what felt like an hour of trekking through the snow, Daniel finally noticed something. The paw prints started to come together, leading toward a rocky formation where a mound of snow seemed to have been recently disturbed. His heart skipped a beat. He was close. "Just a little further," he whispered, pushing forward despite the cold that numbed his fingers and toes. As he approached the entrance of what appeared to be a small den, Daniel crouched down, trying to stay quiet. His eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he squinted to see inside. That's when he saw them. 3 small, trembling wolf pups huddled together for warmth. They were scared, their tiny bodies shaking in the freezing air. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. They were just babies, barely old enough to fend for themselves. Without their mother, they didn't stand a chance. One of the pups let out a soft whimper, and the others tried to burrow deeper into the snow, terrified of the stranger now standing at the entrance of their den. "Hey, it's okay," Daniel whispered, his voice soft as he crouched lower, trying not to frighten them more. "I'm not here to hurt you." He knew they couldn't understand him, but the words made him feel calmer. He needed to act fast. The pups were weak, and if he didn't get them back to their mother soon, it would be too late. Carefully, Daniel set his backpack down and unzipped it, creating a makeshift carrier. He knew the only way to transport them safely was to put them inside, but convincing 3 scared pups to come with him was going to be a challenge. Slowly, he reached out toward the closest pup. The tiny creature bared its teeth in a feeble attempt to growl, a sound so soft it almost made Daniel smile. "Tough little guy, huh?" he murmured. "I'm trying to help." With a swift but gentle motion, Daniel grabbed the first pup by the scruff of its neck, just as the mother would, and placed it inside the backpack. The pup squirmed a little, but eventually settled. Daniel moved quickly, scooping up the other 2 pups one by one. They whimpered and struggled, but within minutes, all 3 were safely inside the backpack, their small cries muffled as he zipped it halfway closed. As soon as the pups were secure, Daniel stood up, adjusting the weight of the bag on his back. The sound of the pups' whimpers tugged at his heart. They were scared, and he couldn't blame them. But they had no idea that he was taking them back to their mother, their only chance of survival. "We're almost there," he said, though the words were more for his own reassurance than theirs. He turned and began the long trek back to the river, where the wolf still waited. The hike back was even more difficult than the journey out. The snow felt heavier, and the trees seemed to close in even more as the sky began to darken. The cold was relentless, seeping through Daniel's clothes and chilling him to the bone. But the sound of the pups whimpering in the backpack kept him moving forward. He couldn't stop now. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel finally saw the river in the distance. His heart lifted when he heard the familiar low growl of the mother wolf. She was still there, waiting, and her eyes were trained on him as he approached. She knew he was coming. "I've got them," Daniel said, his voice shaky with exhaustion. He was still a few yards away, but he could see the wolf's eyes flicker with recognition as she heard the muffled cries of her pups. He knelt down, slowly unzipping the backpack. The pups scrambled out as soon as they were free, their tiny bodies stumbling through the snow toward their mother. The wolf let out a soft whine as her pups reached her, burying their faces into her fur and nursing immediately. Daniel watched in silence, his breath catching in his throat. The relief in the air was almost palpable. The pups were safe. The mother had them back. But there was still tension in the air. He had done what he set out to do, but the wolf was still hurt. And now, he had to figure out how to help her. As the pups settled beside their mother, Daniel took a deep breath, knowing the hardest part was still to come. Daniel made his way down the small hill toward the river, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of the moment settled over him. He could hear the whimpering of the pups in his backpack, their tiny cries filling the quiet wilderness. Ahead, the mother wolf was waiting, still caught in the trap, her eyes locked onto him as he approached. Her growls had returned, low and threatening, warning him to stay back. But Daniel wasn't going to back down. He had come too far. As he reached a safe distance, the pups' cries grew louder. He knelt down carefully, unzipping the backpack and releasing them one by one. The first pup stumbled in the snow, disoriented, but immediately headed toward the wolf, followed closely by the other 2. The moment they reached her, they buried themselves in her fur, desperately nursing and huddling for warmth. The wolf's posture changed instantly. Her low growls stopped, replaced by a soft whine as she licked her pups, relief visible in her eyes. She was no longer focused on Daniel, but entirely on her pups, inspecting them, making sure they were okay. For a brief moment, Daniel thought the tension might finally be easing. But as soon as he took a step forward, hoping to get close enough to help her, the wolf's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto him, and the growl returned, sharper this time, a clear signal. Stay away. Daniel froze, raising his hands in surrender. Easy. I'm just trying to help, he said softly, knowing she didn't understand his words, but hoping the tone might calm her. He needed to free her from the trap, but the wolf wasn't about to let him get near her while her pups were still vulnerable. Every time he moved closer, even just an inch, her growls deepened, and her body tensed as if she were preparing to lunge. He had no doubt that, if she could, she would attack to protect her pups, no matter how injured she was. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure how to get close without spooking her. The wolf clearly didn't trust him, despite the fact that he'd brought her pups back. But he couldn't just leave her trapped like that. She would never survive long enough to care for them. He reached into his pack, pulling out more jerky. It had worked a little before. Maybe, just maybe, food would distract her again. He tossed a few pieces toward her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The wolf glanced at the food but didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on him, still wary. Daniel crouched down and waited. He knew that rushing wouldn't help. Slowly, after several long moments, the wolf leaned forward, sniffing the jerky cautiously. She looked back at Daniel, still watching him closely, but this time she grabbed the food and ate it, keeping her gaze on him the whole time. "That's it," Daniel whispered, a glimmer of hope in his voice. He reached into his bag and tossed another piece of jerky closer to her, inching forward as quietly as he could. The wolf watched him, still tense, but she didn't growl. She seemed to be softening, just a little, as if realizing that he wasn't a threat. Daniel took a deep breath and got closer, careful not to move too fast or too suddenly. He was now just a few feet away from her, close enough to see the trap clearly. The rusted metal dug deep into her leg, and Daniel winced at the sight of it. The snow around the trap was stained with blood, and the wolf's breathing was ragged, showing just how much pain she was in. "I need to help you," Daniel said softly, his voice calm and steady. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over the trap. The wolf growled low in her throat, but didn't move. Her eyes flicked between him and her pups, as if weighing her options. For a moment, Daniel wasn't sure if she would let him near her. But when she didn't pull away or snap at him, he took it as a sign to continue. Carefully, Daniel examined the trap. It was old and rusted, but the mechanism was still functional. He'd have to use a lot of strength to pry it open, and the wolf wouldn't like it. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the metal, his heart racing. If she decided to attack, he had no way to defend himself. "All right, girl, here we go," he muttered under his breath. With one strong pull, Daniel began to force the trap open. The wolf growled louder, her body tensing up, but she didn't move to bite him. Instead, she watched closely, her ears pinned back, clearly in pain, but somehow understanding that he was trying to help. The trap creaked as it opened, and with a final push, Daniel managed to pry it loose. The wolf's leg slipped free from the metal jaws, and she immediately pulled it back, limping away a few steps as her pups crowded around her. Daniel stumbled back, breathing hard, his hands shaking from the effort and the adrenaline. He half expected the wolf to turn on him now that she was free, but she didn't. Instead, she limped a few feet away, then collapsed into the snow, her pups nuzzling against her for warmth. For the first time, the wolf didn't growl at him. She was watching him, exhausted, but there was no aggression in her eyes. Just quiet acceptance. Daniel stayed where he was, not daring to get any closer. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. The wolf was free, and her pups were safe. He had done what he came to do, As the evening shadows grew longer, Daniel stood up slowly, his muscles aching from the tension. He gathered his things, giving one last look at the wolf and her pups. The air between them was different now. The danger had passed, replaced by a fragile trust. Without saying a word, Daniel turned and started walking back toward his camp. He didn't tell anyone what had happened when he returned that night. Some things, he figured, were better left unsaid. In the days that followed the encounter with the wolf, Daniel found himself restless. He had returned to the camp that night without a word to his companions. How could he explain what had happened? They wouldn't understand. No one would. The connection he had felt with the wolf, the tension, the silent understanding, it wasn't something you could just tell someone. And as much as he tried to shake it off, the thought of the wolf and her pups kept pulling him back. The image of the mother wolf limping away after he freed her stayed with him. He knew she and her pups were still out there, vulnerable. Even though he had removed the trap, she was still injured, and there were predators and dangers all around. And for some reason, Daniel couldn't let it go. 3 days after freeing the wolf, Daniel woke up early, before anyone else in the camp. The cold bite of the Alaskan air greeted him as he stepped outside, his breath turning to mist in the dim light of dawn. Without a second thought, he packed some more jerky and supplies into his backpack and headed out toward the river. He had no plan other than to check on the wolf, to make sure she was still okay. Something inside him pulled him back there, like an invisible thread connecting him to that spot. The journey to the river was familiar now, and when Daniel arrived, he immediately scanned the area, hoping to spot the wolf. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the river and the rustling of the wind through the trees. But then he heard it, a soft whine, followed by the unmistakable sound of pups yipping. Daniel's heart leaped. They were still here. He moved slowly, carefully following the sound, and then he saw them. The mother wolf was lying under the shade of a tree, her pups playfully tumbling over each other, unaware of the danger that still loomed in their world. The mother wolf's eyes flicked up to him as he approached. She didn't growl this time, but her gaze was as sharp and cautious as ever. Daniel stopped a few yards away, giving her space. He wasn't sure how she would react, but he hoped that she remembered him, that she knew he wasn't a threat. Slowly, he reached into his backpack and pulled out some more jerky, tossing it gently toward her. The wolf sniffed the air but didn't move toward the food. She was still watching him closely, her body tense. Daniel knelt down in the snow, lowering himself to make her feel less threatened. "I'm just here to help," he murmured quietly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "I want to make sure you're okay." The wolf's eyes flicked to the jerky, but she stayed still. The pups, however, were growing curious. The smallest one, with a soft grey coat, took a few tentative steps toward Daniel, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Daniel smiled softly as the pup approached, still wobbly on its legs. Before long, the other pups followed, scampering toward him, their tiny bodies tripping over the snow as they explored this new human. They sniffed at his boots, pawed at his gloves, and one even nipped at the edge of his jacket. Daniel chuckled quietly. "You're not scared of me, huh?" he whispered, reaching out to gently scratch behind the ear of one of the pups. The small creature responded by licking his hand, its tail wagging. The mother wolf watched the interaction closely, her eyes narrowing as Daniel touched her pups. But she didn't growl or make any move to stop them. Daniel felt the tension in the air shift, just slightly. She was still on guard, but maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. Over the next few minutes, the pups grew bolder, jumping on Daniel and licking his hands, their playful energy filling the quiet of the forest. The more time he spent with them, the more Daniel felt a sense of calm wash over him. There was something deeply peaceful about being accepted by these small, wild creatures. As he pet the pups, Daniel couldn't help but glance up at the mother wolf. She was still watching, her body language protective but less hostile than before. He knew that earning her trust would take time. She wasn't like the pups, easily won over with a little food and affection. She had lived in the wild her whole life, and she knew the dangers that lurked in the world. Trusting a human, especially one who had trapped her kind before, wasn't going to come easily. Daniel kept his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want to push too far, but as one of the pups nudged closer to him, playfully pawing at his knee, Daniel reached out to scratch its back. The moment his hand touched the pup, the mother wolf's ears flattened, and she let out a low growl. Daniel froze, pulling his hand back immediately. "It's okay," he whispered, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt them." The growl faded, but the mother wolf's eyes stayed locked on him, watching his every move. Daniel knew he had crossed a line. She wasn't ready to let him get that close to her pups yet. But then, something unexpected happened. As Daniel stayed still, waiting to see what the wolf would do next, she did something he hadn't anticipated. She wagged her tail. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was there. A brief flick of her tail, almost like a signal that she understood. She wasn't fully trusting him yet, but she wasn't rejecting him either. Daniel's heart swelled with hope. Maybe he was finally starting to break through her walls. Over the next few minutes, he didn't try to approach her again. Instead, he sat quietly with the pups, letting them climb on him and sniff his clothes while their mother watched from a safe distance. He knew this was progress, small but real. The bond was forming, slowly but surely. When the sun started to dip lower in the sky, Daniel knew it was time to leave. He stood up, dusting the snow off his pants and giving the pups one last pat on the head. The mother wolf watched him closely but didn't move. There was no growling this time, no aggressive posturing, just quiet observation. Daniel gave her a nod as he turned to leave, feeling the weight of the day's progress settle over him. He didn't know how long it would take to earn her full trust, but he was willing to keep trying. As he walked back to the camp, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't just about helping the wolf anymore. It was about something deeper, something that connected him to her and her pups in a way he couldn't fully explain. He had saved her once. Now, they were starting to save each other. The days had turned into a quiet, almost ritualistic routine between Daniel and the wolf. Each morning, he made the same journey back to the river with food in his pack, always hoping to see the wolf and her pups. And every day, he found them in the same spot, waiting, with the pups eagerly running toward him as he approached. The mother wolf, though still cautious, no longer growled when she saw him. Her sharp eyes stayed focused on him, but the aggression had faded, replaced by something closer to curiosity. Daniel moved carefully, never pushing too far, always respecting the wolf's space. The pups, however, had no such reservations. They bounded toward him as soon as he arrived, tumbling over each other in their excitement. They had come to trust him completely, licking his hands and playfully pawing at his clothes as if he were one of their own. But the mother wolf was different. She watched everything with a wary eye, still on guard. Daniel understood. She had been through too much to let her defenses down easily. Trust, for her, wasn't given. It had to be earned. And yet, each day he came back, there was a small, subtle shift in the way she looked at him. She was beginning to let him in. One morning, as Daniel prepared to make his usual trip to the river, he felt a growing sense of urgency. He had been feeding the wolf and her pups for days, but there was still one thing left to do. The wolf's leg, though freed from the trap, was still injured, and he knew she wouldn't fully heal until the last traces of the trap's metal were gone. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to help her, no matter how risky it might be. That morning, he packed his usual jerky, but this time, he also brought his tools, a pair of wire cutters and some pliers he used for the mining equipment. He wasn't sure if the wolf would let him get close enough, but he had to try. When he arrived at the river, the pups greeted him as usual, tumbling out of the brush and racing to him with their tails wagging. Daniel smiled and knelt down to pet them, his heart lifting at their innocent joy. But today, his focus was on their mother. The wolf lay a short distance away, watching closely as her pups nuzzled Daniel's hands. She didn't growl or make any aggressive moves, but her eyes were locked on him, sharp and alert. Daniel could tell she was still guarded, still not entirely sure of his intentions. He pulled out some jerky and tossed it toward her, as he had done every day. She sniffed the air and, after a moment, leaned forward to take the food. Daniel watched her carefully. Her movements were slower now, her limp more pronounced. Her leg was still bothering her, and the wound wasn't healing as it should. "This is it," Daniel muttered to himself. "It's now or never." He took a deep breath and stood up slowly, the pups still playfully biting at his boots. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the wire cutters, holding them low so as not to startle the wolf. His heart was pounding, but he moved forward with calm, deliberate steps. The wolf's eyes followed his every movement, but she didn't growl or back away. "I'm going to help you," Daniel said softly, knowing his words didn't matter, but hoping the tone of his voice would. He got closer, his hands trembling slightly as he crouched near the wolf. She tensed, but didn't move. Daniel could see the trap's remnants embedded in her fur, a small piece of rusted metal that had caused her so much pain. He needed to cut it loose. Slowly, carefully, Daniel reached for the injured leg. The wolf stiffened, a low growl rumbling in her throat, but she didn't pull away. Daniel froze for a moment, his hand hovering just above the metal. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, there was a flicker of understanding between them. With a steady hand, Daniel brought the wire cutters to the metal. He clamped down and, with a sharp snap, the rusted piece broke free. The wolf flinched slightly, but didn't growl. Daniel worked quickly, using the pliers to remove the remaining bits of metal from her fur. It took only a few minutes, but each second felt like an eternity as he worked, knowing that one wrong move could end with a snap of her jaws. Finally, the last piece of the trap was gone. Daniel sat back, exhaling deeply, his heart still racing. The wolf limped away a few steps, her leg free but still tender. She paused, looking back at him, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Daniel didn't know what to expect next. She could still attack, still see him as a threat, even after all this time. But instead, she did something that took him completely by surprise. She wagged her tail. It was a small movement, just a gentle swish of her tail in the snow, but it was there, a sign of trust, of acceptance. Daniel's heart swelled. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant everything. He smiled, watching as the wolf turned back to her pups. They rushed to her side, excited and playful, oblivious to the significance of the moment. The mother wolf limped toward the trees, her pups following closely, and Daniel watched as they disappeared into the forest, blending into the shadows. For a long time, Daniel sat there, staring at the spot where they had been. He had done it. The wolf was free, really free, and for the first time since he had found her, she was no longer in pain. A strange mix of emotions washed over him, relief, joy, and a deep sense of peace. He had connected with this wild creature in a way he never thought possible. It wasn't just about removing the trap or feeding her pups. It was something deeper, something that tied them together in a way he couldn't fully explain. As the sky began to darken, Daniel gathered his things and stood up, feeling lighter than he had in days. He gave one last glance toward the forest, where the wolf had vanished, and then started his walk back to camp. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but it didn't matter. She was free, and that was all that counted. After Daniel's final encounter with the wolf, time seemed to move quickly. Snow continued to fall over Alaska, covering any traces of the events that had unfolded. Life at the mining camp returned to its usual routine, and Daniel, though present physically, found his mind constantly drifting back to the wolf and her pups. The wilderness had left a mark on him, and he knew it wasn't something he could easily forget. Weeks passed, and the supplies at camp began to dwindle. The harsh winter grew stronger, forcing the group of men to decide it was time to leave and return to civilization. The journey back to their homes was long and quiet. the biting cold following them all the way. For Daniel, the world of New Jersey felt impossibly far away from the untamed land he was leaving behind. But the memory of what had happened, freeing the wolf, earning her trust, stayed with him, as vivid as ever. 5 years later, Daniel's life had taken a different path. He no longer chased adventure and fortune in the wilderness. He had settled into a stable job as a supervisor at a finishing company. The steady, predictable life in New Jersey was comfortable, and the wild, dangerous world of Alaska felt like a distant dream. But some nights, when Daniel lay awake, he would find himself thinking of that wolf, the way her eyes had locked with his, the silent understanding they had shared. He had told the story to a few close friends, but most of them laughed it off as a tall tale. A wolf trusting a human? That's just a good campfire story, they'd say, shaking their heads. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't need their validation. The experience was his alone, and that was enough. One morning, while sitting at his desk at work, Daniel received an unexpected assignment. The company was sending him back to Alaska to oversee the completion of a construction project in a small village. He hadn't planned on returning to that place, but now the opportunity had presented itself, and something inside him stirred. A few days later, Daniel found himself on a plane, heading back to the cold, rugged landscape of Alaska. The village was only a few miles from the area where he had worked as a miner years before. As the plane descended, and the familiar mountains and endless stretches of snow came into view, a sense of nostalgia washed over him. Alaska hadn't changed. It was still as vast, wild, and mysterious as ever. Once he arrived, Daniel quickly fell into his new routine, overseeing the construction and making sure everything was running smoothly. The villagers were friendly, though reserved, and the work moved along without much trouble. But as the days went by, Daniel found himself drawn to the wilderness surrounding the village. The mountains, the forests, the snow-covered hills. They called to him, stirring memories of the wolf and her pups. One day, with work running smoothly, Daniel decided to take a break. He borrowed a snowmobile from one of the locals and set out on a quick trip to a neighboring village to deliver a letter. The journey should have been easy, just a few miles through the snow. But as he was riding through the vast, frozen expanse, the snowmobile's engine sputtered and died. Daniel tried everything to get it running again, but the machine refused to start. "Great," he muttered, frustrated as he looked around. The sky was already starting to darken, and the nearest village was still a mile or two away. The cold was intensifying, and the last thing he wanted was to be stranded out here in the wilderness after dark. He started walking, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the snow, but Daniel knew the beauty of the landscape could quickly turn dangerous. The cold was biting through his jacket, and the silence around him felt heavier with every step. He kept moving, but there was an unsettling feeling growing in his chest, a sense that he wasn't alone. And then he heard it. A soft crunch in the snow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stopped and listened. The noise was faint, but it was there. Something was moving. Slowly, Daniel turned around. At first, he saw nothing but trees and snow. But then, in the distance, shadows began to move. 5 of them. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. A pack of wolves was approaching, their dark shapes moving silently through the snow. They were circling him, their movements slow and deliberate. Daniel's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat. He knew the danger. Being caught alone in the wilderness with wolves stalking you was a nightmare. They were skilled hunters, and once they surrounded you, there was little chance of escape. He counted 5 wolves, their eyes gleaming in the fading light. One of the wolves, larger than the others, stepped forward, leading the pack. Daniel's muscles tensed as he realized what was about to happen. His mind raced, searching for options, but there were none. He was trapped. The lead wolf moved closer, stopping just a few yards from Daniel. Its eyes locked onto his, unblinking, assessing. Daniel felt his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he had no hope of outrunning them. This was it. But then, something strange happened. The wolf in front of him hesitated. It didn't lunge or growl. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. The other wolves stayed in formation, waiting for a signal, but the leader didn't attack. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he looked into the wolf's eyes, and in that moment, something clicked. It was her, the mother wolf. She was older now, her fur more worn and grayer than before, but there was no doubt in Daniel's mind. It was the same wolf he had freed all those years ago, the same wolf whose pups he had saved. For a long moment, they stood there, eyes locked. Daniel's fear melted away, replaced by a deep sense of recognition. The wolf didn't move. Neither did he. And then, as if making a decision, the wolf slowly wagged her tail, just once, and turned away. Without a sound, the other wolves followed her lead, melting back into the shadows of the forest. Daniel stood there, frozen in place, his breath shaky and his heart pounding. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The wolf he had saved so long ago had just spared his life. She had recognized him, and in that moment, repaid the debt. The air around him seemed quieter now, as if the forest itself had paused to acknowledge what had just transpired. The wolves were gone, disappearing into the snow, leaving Daniel standing alone. He let out a long, shaky breath, trying to process what had just happened. Slowly, he turned and began walking toward the village, his mind reeling. The cold no longer seemed as biting, and the weight of what he had just experienced made each step feel surreal. Years ago, Daniel had saved a wolf and her pups. Now, when he had been surrounded by danger, the wolf had returned the favor. The cycle had come full circle. The cold air still wrapped around Daniel as he stood in the snow, his heart pounding from what had just happened. The wolves had vanished into the darkness of the forest, their silent departure as eerie as their approach. But the encounter, the recognition in the mother wolf's eyes, left Daniel frozen in place, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had just occurred. The very same wolf he had saved years ago had now saved him in return. It was almost too surreal to believe, yet it had unfolded right in front of him. For a long moment, Daniel stood there, his breath clouding the air as he tried to calm his racing heart. He could still feel the intensity of the moment, the wolves circling, the tension, as the pack leader, the mother wolf, sized him up. But instead of attacking, she had remembered. She had chosen to spare him. It felt like a moment out of a dream, but the snow under his boots and the icy wind on his skin reminded him it was real. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. He was still several miles from the village, and night was closing in fast. The encounter had left him shaken, but he couldn't afford to stand there any longer, not with the temperature dropping and the wilderness still full of dangers. The cold was beginning to seep through his layers, making his fingers and toes numb. He needed to get to safety. As he walked, his mind replayed the scene over and over. The wolves had him surrounded, their eyes gleaming in the fading light. But it was her, the mother wolf, who had stopped them. Her hesitation, her calm, and finally, the slight wag of her tail before she led them away. It was a sign that she remembered the day he had freed her, the day he had risked his own safety to save her and her pups. The weight of that realization settled over him. The bond between him and that wolf was something beyond words, something primal and unspoken. Daniel had always known that animals could feel and understand more than humans gave them credit for. But this was different. The connection between them had lasted across years and miles, and tonight it had saved his life. The lights of the village came into view as the sky darkened to a deep, dusky blue. Daniel's legs ached from the long walk, but the warmth and safety ahead gave him the strength to push through the last stretch. As he entered the village, a few of the locals were still outside, gathering wood or tending to their homes before the night fully set in. Daniel nodded at a couple of the men, but didn't stop to chat. His mind was still too consumed by what had just happened. He walked directly to his cabin, the warmth inside welcoming him as he stepped through the door. The fire in the hearth had been burning low, so he quickly added a few logs and sat down in the chair by the flames, staring into the flickering light. The heat began to thaw his frozen fingers, but his thoughts were still far from the cozy cabin. He couldn't shake the image of the wolf pack, their silent presence, the way they moved as a single unit, skilled, methodical, deadly. And yet, in the middle of that pack, there had been a moment of recognition, a moment that had changed everything. Could it really have been her? Daniel whispered to himself, though deep down he already knew the answer. It was her. There was no mistaking it. The way she had looked at him, not with aggression, but with something closer to understanding. It was the same wolf he had saved from the trap years before. She was older now, her fur more weathered, but it was unmistakably her. Daniel leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as the warmth of the fire slowly eased the tension in his body. He hadn't expected to find closure on this trip. In fact, he hadn't expected to find anything beyond the work he was sent to do. But now he realized that returning to Alaska had been more than just a job. It had been a chance to finish a story that had started years earlier, a story that had come full circle. The next day, Daniel woke early. His body was still sore from the long walk through the snow, but his mind felt clearer than it had in days. As he went about his duties, overseeing the final phases of construction in the village, his thoughts kept drifting back to the wolves. He kept replaying the events in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. Later that afternoon, while taking a break, Daniel stood outside, looking toward the dense forest that stretched out beyond the village. He couldn't help but wonder if the wolf pack was still nearby, watching from the trees. Maybe they had moved on, returning to their hunt, or maybe they were still close, keeping their distance but aware of his presence. A soft crunch of snow behind him broke his thoughts, and Daniel turned to see Mark, one of the workers from the village, approaching him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mark said, smiling as he leaned on his shovel. Daniel chuckled lightly, though the weight of the previous night still sat heavy on his shoulders. "Something like that." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Wolves?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I ran into a pack last night. Thought I was done for." Mark's face grew serious. "You're lucky. A pack of wolves doesn't usually spare anyone out there." Daniel paused, his gaze drifting back to the forest. "Yeah, lucky." But he knew it wasn't just luck. The mother wolf had recognized him. She had remembered the day he saved her, and she had returned the favor. It wasn't something he could explain to anyone, not without them thinking he was crazy. But he didn't care. It was a truth he would carry with him, something that connected him to the wild in a way few people ever experienced. Mark gave him a curious look, sensing there was more to the story, but didn't press for details. "Well, stay sharp. Wolves aren't the only danger out there." Daniel nodded, though he already knew that. The wilderness had its own set of rules, and last night he had seen just how thin the line was between life and death. That night, as Daniel sat by the fire once more, he thought back to the moment the mother wolf had hesitated. He thought about the brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, the moment of shared understanding between them. It was a moment that transcended language or species, a moment of connection. He knew he might never see her again. The wilderness was vast, and wolves roamed freely, constantly on the move. But that didn't matter. He had been given a second chance, just as he had once given her. And that bond, that silent exchange between them, was enough. Daniel stared into the flames, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. Alaska had always been a wild, unpredictable place, full of danger and beauty. But now, it felt like a part of him, a place where his story and the wolf's story had intertwined in a way that would never be undone. As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, Daniel closed his eyes, knowing that the cycle was complete. The wolf had returned, not as a predator, but as a protector. And in that moment, he understood the profound connection they shared, one of survival, trust, and respect. The wilderness had given him a gift, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. The days passed slowly, but for Daniel, each one felt like it carried a hidden weight. The encounter with the wolf pack, and most importantly, with the mother wolf, stayed with him. Though he was back in the village, working, overseeing the final details of the construction project, his mind was elsewhere. The image of the wolf standing before him, recognizing him after all those years, was something he couldn't shake. One afternoon, after finishing his tasks for the day, Daniel decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to process what had happened. The village was small, and it didn't take long for him to reach the edge, where the wilderness stretched out endlessly before him. The trees, covered in snow, stood tall and still, as if waiting. It was quiet here, peaceful in a way that the city back in New Jersey never was. He walked deeper into the forest, following a familiar path that he had taken many times before. But this time, something was different. There was a pull inside him, an instinct guiding him. He didn't know exactly where he was going or what he expected to find, but he kept moving, drawn by a feeling he couldn't explain. As he walked, the sound of his footsteps in the snow seemed louder than usual. The wind was soft, barely a breeze, and the air was crisp and cold. After about an hour, Daniel stopped at a spot he remembered well, the place where he had first freed the mother wolf from the trap years ago. The memories rushed back, the tension, the fear, and the strange bond that had formed between them in that moment. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and he was right back there again. He stood still for a long time, staring into the trees. The forest was silent, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. There was a presence here, something watching him, just out of sight. His heart began to race, though he didn't feel afraid. It was more like anticipation, as if he were waiting for something to reveal itself. And then, out of the shadows, a familiar figure appeared. The mother wolf stepped forward from the trees, moving slowly and deliberately. Her fur was grayer now, her movements a bit slower than they had been before, but Daniel recognized her immediately. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wolf stood a few yards away, her yellow eyes locked on Daniel, just as they had been years before. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence around them thick and heavy. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but not out of fear. It was something else, something deeper. The wolf didn't growl or bare her teeth. She didn't show any signs of aggression. Instead, she simply watched him, as if trying to understand why he was there. And Daniel, in turn, watched her, feeling the same strange connection he had felt all those years ago. He knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He didn't know if the wolf remembered him, but something in her eyes told him she did. There was no fear, no tension between them, just a quiet understanding. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Daniel whispered, his voice soft in the stillness. The wolf tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching as if she were listening. Then, in a moment that made Daniel's heart skip a beat, she took a few steps closer. She was still cautious, still wild, but there was no mistaking the trust in her movements. Daniel stayed still, barely breathing, as the wolf came within a few feet of him. He didn't reach out, didn't try to touch her. He knew better than that. But he could feel the bond between them, stronger now than ever before. It was as if the years hadn't mattered, as if they were picking up right where they had left off. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, man and wolf. Two creatures from completely different worlds, but somehow connected. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how much this moment meant to him until now. This was the closure he didn't know he needed. The wolf took another step closer, and Daniel's eyes widened as she lowered her head slightly. She was so close now that he could see the individual strands of her fur, the silver grey mixed with darker streaks. Her breath puffed out in soft clouds as she watched him, unblinking. And then, as if to confirm what he had already known deep down, She wagged her tail. It was a small, subtle movement, but it was there, a gesture of trust, of acceptance. Daniel smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek before he even realized it. He had no words, but he didn't need any. This moment, this silent exchange, was enough. After a few more seconds, the wolf stepped back, her gaze still locked on his. Daniel remained kneeling in the snow, watching her, his heart full. He knew this was goodbye. The wolf had come to see him one last time, to acknowledge the bond they shared. But now it was time for her to return to the wild. Without another sound, the wolf turned and slowly disappeared back into the trees, her form blending into the shadows until she was gone. Daniel stayed there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had vanished. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him, as if a part of him had finally settled. The bond between them had been real, stronger than he could have ever imagined, and now it had come full circle. He stood up slowly, brushing the snow off his knees, and looked around the forest. The quiet had returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt right. The wolf was gone, but the connection they had formed would stay with him forever. As he turned to head back to the village, Daniel felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know if he would ever see the wolf again, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they had shared, the trust they had built. That was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. With one last glance at the forest, Daniel started the walk back to the village, knowing that the wilderness had given him something far more valuable than he had ever expected. A connection that transcended words, a bond between man and wolf that would stay with him always. As Daniel walked back to the village, the sound of the wolf's last steps still echoed in his mind. The quiet of the Alaskan wilderness wrapped around him, but instead of feeling cold and isolated, he felt a sense of warmth, a deep connection to the land and the creatures that lived in it. His encounter with the wolf had been more than just a reunion. It was the closing of a chapter that had begun years before, when he first freed her from that cruel trap. The village came into view as the sky turned from deep blue to dusk. The warmth from the fires in the small cabins beckoned him, but Daniel lingered for a moment, looking back at the forest one last time. Somewhere in that vast, untamed wilderness, the mother wolf had returned to her pack, and Daniel knew he had done everything he could for her. Their story was now complete. That night, sitting by the fire in his cabin, Daniel reflected on everything that had happened since he first came to Alaska. He had come here years ago as a young man, chasing dreams of gold, seeking adventure. But what he had found was something far more valuable, a deep connection to nature, to a wild creature that had taught him more about survival and trust than he ever could have imagined. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth, but Daniel's thoughts were far away, back in the snow-covered forest. The bond he had shared with the wolf wasn't something he could easily explain to others. It wasn't about taming her or gaining control. It was about respect, about understanding that, in the wild, trust was the most fragile and valuable thing you could offer. In the days that followed, Daniel finished his work in the village, but something had changed in him. The encounter with the wolf had left a deep imprint, and he knew he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. When it was finally time to leave Alaska, Daniel felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. He was ready to return home, but part of him knew he would never truly leave this place behind. Months later, back in New Jersey, Daniel resumed his normal routine. His work, his friends, his life. Everything returned to the way it had been before. But something was different. He no longer felt the restless need for adventure, the drive to chase after something bigger. That need had been replaced by a calm certainty, a deep understanding that the most meaningful experiences in life often come from the quietest moments. He didn't tell many people about the wolf. It was a story too personal, too extraordinary to share with just anyone. He had saved her once, and in return, she had saved him, not just from danger, but from the weight of his own expectations. That was enough for him. Occasionally, when he sat by his window at night, watching the moonlight reflect off the quiet streets, Daniel would find himself thinking of Alaska. He would close his eyes and remember the feeling of the cold air, the sound of the snow beneath his boots, and the sight of the mother wolf emerging from the trees. He would remember the way she had looked at him, not as prey, not as a threat, but as something familiar. And he would remember the gentle wag of her tail, the final gesture of trust between them. That bond, that connection between man and wolf, was something he would carry with him always. It was a reminder that even in the wildest, most dangerous places, there is a space for understanding and trust. A space where two lives, so different, could cross paths and leave each other forever changed. Daniel smiled softly to himself as he gazed out at the night. The world was vast and unpredictable, but he had found his place in it. He had found peace, not through conquering the wild, but by becoming part of it, by respecting its creatures and earning their trust. As he lay down to sleep, Daniel felt the weight of everything he had learned settle comfortably within him. The cycle had completed. The wolf had come full circle, and so had he. And now, after all these years, he finally understood what it all meant. The fire in his heart that had once pushed him to seek out new adventures had quieted, replaced by a steady warmth. The warmth of knowing that he had made a difference, that he had saved a life, and that in doing so, he had found something even greater. The bond between man and wolf was eternal, and Daniel knew that wherever the mother wolf roamed, they would always be connected. As sleep finally claimed him, Daniel dreamed of snow-covered forests, of wolves running silently through the trees, and of a lone figure standing at the edge of the wilderness, watching over him, just as she always had.